Hello, NEURISA Day 2020. We're officially back. Love to welcome you all back to the show. Our first special guest for this discussion, our President-elect Jody Gosselin, to help me sort of discuss things with Rebekah. So I know that Jody's here. Hey, Jody.
Hi, everyone.
Awesome. And then, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Rebekah Jones. You may recognize her from such places as CNN or the New York Times. We just call her friends now. We're all buddies. So Rebekah, welcome. Thanks for coming today. We're really, really, really glad to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So Rebekah, I'm thinking, could you just maybe give a brief introduction of yourself? I think you'd probably say it best, and then we'll get right into things. Is that okay?
So I'm Rebekah Jones. I'm a geographer. And from January through May of this year, I was the manager of COVID-19 data and surveillance for the Florida Department of Health. I was somewhat famously fired from refusing to manipulate data to drum up support for a political agenda. And sometime after that, I saw what was happening in Florida, which I'm sure all of you are aware of what happened in Florida over the summer, and felt a need to provide information to people that was as accurate as possible without the political aspects influencing how it was presented. So I founded Florida COVID Action, which is back there. It might be backwards for you guys, but and then I worked on that for a long time, and a new problem popped up, and I ended up co-founding the COVID Monitor with FinMango and Google, which tracks cases in K-12 schools across the country. You can go to our map and data site there from the covidmonitor.com, and if you go to our official data sources, you'll see we're roping in a lot of the country. And so that's what I've been working on. And yeah, I've done the media rounds since this happened. That I keep getting asked to do it is strange because I'm the most awkward person in the world. But I'm always happy to talk with our community, because when everything first happened to me, NEURISA was one of the first, if not the first, organization to publicly condemn what was going on. And that means, when you're a person in that position, thrust into the spotlight when you don't want to be, is a huge help. So that's me. That's what I'm doing.
That's incredible. I can tell everyone this. I think that everyone probably knows that I'm also the GIS manager for the Rhode Island Department of Health, and as well as being the president of NEURISA. And I can tell you that because we were in the COVID situation as well for Rhode Island, our team picked up on your story right away. And it really sat home with me because, honestly, I can say this, the team at the Department of Health in Rhode Island is amazing. And I know there's so much work to do that having to unpack these things can sometimes lead to just difficulties in understanding the data itself. And then, honestly, there has been some politicization of data. I've seen it throughout the United States. And sometimes that just means people doing things differently without consistency. So when your story came about, we all just gleamed onto it because it felt like what we were going through. And, honestly, I can't believe that happened to me, to be completely honest. And being a public health servant as well, to go from being a public health servant to be, thrown into the media like this is pretty unbelievable.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking is, let's start off a little bit about your background, if you don't mind, just sort of how you got to January of last year. And then, like we talked about on the phone, a little kind of like how the timeline of events and how things really went down in the spring. And then we'll get to some other things. Can we start there?
Yeah. So this is always going to be the abbreviated version because there are a million little things that happen every single day that you can't really capture in this kind of overview. The details of one thing that you were asked to do that felt a little off, but you did it and then forgot about it. As I write about this experience, I'm remembering a lot more that had happened. But so I started at the Florida Department of Health right after I finished my coursework for my PhD at Florida State. And while I was working on my dissertation, I needed a job pay bills. And I started as an analyst in 2018. And I was kind of the catch-all for hazards, for health hazards analyst for the whole state Department of Health. So I did like Hurricane Michael response, hepatitis A outbreaks, influenza, a lot of tobacco related stuff, anything that basically was a risk or hazard to human health. I was one of those analysts. And less than a year after starting there, my boss, the GIS manager for the state, so the same position the Jay's in, moved laterally to a different agency, and I took over his job. And I was doing that during Hurricane Dorian, which for us, I know people in Northeast don't know, that was terrifying. Having a Category 5 hurricane sitting 20 miles off the coast of Miami, just spinning for days, was exhausting. So I was, deep into the response type team. We had a team within the Department of Health that was something happened, get the team together. If some truck spills toxic chemicals, get the team together. If this happens, I was one of those people. I was their DRS person. And it helped that my background was academically in climatology and hurricanes in Florida. So, I had a lot of expertise in that arena that a lot of people there didn't have. And so when January came about, I first heard about COVID from my husband, actually, who read an article from, I forget who it was, in late December about a virus in China. My husband is a hypochondriac, so all things viruses he knows about all the time. And then it popped up legitimately on my radar because I just ignored that stuff most of the time, on January 23rd, when Johns Hopkins launched their tracker. And because, the community is great, it was shared widely and broadly, and that's how I found out about it. I forwarded it to my bosses and said, hey, there was this study that came out and saying this is bad. I was like, we've been getting these CDC emails now for a few weeks, and this national tracker, maybe we should put something like this together. I was like, I could do this, over a few days. We could talk about what data we want to use, even if it's just an informative tool, to show the public that we're, on top of this. And for the first several weeks, I was told that we didn't need it and that it was the official position that it wasn't going to be bad here. And this is while we were monitoring more and more people every day. So while I was still being told this, we were monitoring at least 300 people in Florida. By mid-late February, that was up to closer to 600. And I was, again, almost daily encouraging us to have some kind of informative resource, some information about what was going on for the public. I also come from a background in writing and journalism, so I do have a commitment to people having a right to be informed. And especially at that point when we did not know exactly how deadly it was or how contagious it was or anything like that. And then I was told for several weeks that we didn't want to cause a panic. That was our official position. So it went from we don't need it, which we did, to we don't want to cause a panic, which not having information seemed to do more so than having it. And then finally, on the day that the president declared COVID-19 a public health emergency, I was given permission. And not only was I given permission, I was told to finish it by the end of the day. And because I had done so many mock-ups trying to get people to do this, I already had a few templates that I could plug into. I just needed access to the data. And so I had it up that day, and my life became managing this system, pulling all this data, processing it, checking it, scrubbing it, aggregating it, publishing it, managing the APIs, managing the data resource, the repositories, all of that. That was my life between 12 and 16 hours a day, every day for 2 months. And then one Friday evening, I get a call. Hey, so we're going to reopen in a week. We need the team, me, so that would be myself and the epidemiologist and my counterpart in Epi, who's a database manager, need to get together and come up with criteria, kind of base it on the White House if you have to, plan and do the criteria and have the analysis ready and present it by Sunday. And I was told this Friday. And to create a criteria that we didn't know how effective it was, that was the first kind of flag. It's like, well, we don't even know if these are the good criteria yet. I mean, this is still April. But so we basically went with what the White House said, minus all of the things that the state didn't want to do. And then we had to see what data we had that can meet that criteria and how to connect with other agencies that had data that DOH wasn't monitoring, like hospitalizations. DOH never monitored hospitalizations, which is insane. That data came from a different agency that didn't talk to us very much, which was crazy. And so we came up with all this stuff, all the measurements, all the analysis. I slept 3 hours that night, literally 3 hours, and presented the analysis on Sunday and was told no, almost just no. When I went to show the analysis to leadership, which is this ominous thing that we all refer to as leadership. Like, we weren't always sure who leadership was. It was a group of people, political appointees of the Department of Health and the governor's office, media people and other stuff. But every time, you know, they were like, well, leadership wants to approve this. We just sent it off and hoped it got approved. And none of these people were experts. None of them knew anything about the data, how it was managed, how, if you gave them the raw data, they would not know how to make sense of it. So these were people who had no idea what actually went into all this. And when I went to present it, the plan for reopening was being stapled and put together in packets right in front of me. So it was already done. And when the analysis and the data didn't match what that plan said, they started changing how we measured things. And for that, I didn't feel like I had a legitimate objection because it was a policy decision. I thought that exempting all counties with fewer than 75,000 people, which is almost half the counties in Florida, from being subject to the criteria at all because they don't meet it, made having a criteria kind of useless. And I thought that a lot of the other changes were not appropriate, but I did them. When it came down to it and all of the changes still didn't give them the results that they wanted, they told me to open up the data, our data system, and change the numbers so that the analysis would show that they were ready. And to that, I said no. I said, no, I'm not doing that. And I actually laughed. It wasn't that dramatic of a moment when she said that, because we were pulling things up and she was like, oh, well, this one needs to be 10. It's 18. Just change it to 10 for percent positivity because it had to be 10 or below. I went, no, I'm not doing that. Almost in that exact tone. And then she just stared at me and she said, you know, I once had a data person, my favorite, who said, you tell me what you want the numbers to show and I'll make it happen. And she just stared at me. And I realized she was serious. And then I snarkily and probably inappropriately replied to her and said, well, I guess they probably didn't have a PhD either. And that was the last of that conversation. They had to go present their new plan. A few days later, they hired a private vendor to do robust data-driven analysis and science that miraculously came up with exactly the plan that was printed that Sunday, and just left us out of it. And I had real problems with that. And I told my boss I had problems with it. I had talked to him about filing a whistleblower complaint. And before I was able to do that, I was fired. And so that was my spring of this year, to sum up.
Oh my goodness. It's, you know, I know we've talked a couple of times, right? And we've heard different aspects of things, but it's interesting how, I mean, my story was very similar from Rhode Island, as in that amount of time. And when I first got brought into the COVID response, the first thing I heard was, we don't see a need for GIS right now. And this isn't a shot at anybody. It's more about a statement. And I made this statement in the opening remarks, and I'll make it again. It's more of a point to make to these states that they should be having some sort of a high-ranking geographic information officer to help consult the governor on what can be done and what should be done with GIS. Because even by the time I was activated, we already had, I think, 24 cases. And I was already on a bi-weekly call with FEMA. I was already looking at the COVID response from Esri. And so I think it's not, this isn't blaming people, but it's getting that moment to pop in their head and think, wow, GIS can be used here in some instances. And then if people choose to make their own decisions with data or what have you, that's where it goes off the rails, I think. I think the thing, Rebekah, that we were talking about, and I think plays well right here, is just talking about, being a GISP, the idea of that code of ethics. And, what was you were saying they asked you to do something you didn't believe in, but, did you reflect upon the code of ethics? Were you thinking about that? Was that something that you thought, I signed this thing, I'm a GISP, I don't want to, it's not worth sacrificing my reputation for the will of someone else to do what they want. So is that fair?
I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say I was that calculating. But honestly, this is a lifetime of being kicked around for refusing to do what was easy and what was, wrong, or what felt wrong. And it was instinctive. And I think if I had done what they asked and then thought about it, I still would have came to the same place, the same conclusion. But the sad thing is it's kind of irrelevant, because I was the data keeper, the gatekeeper to the data. And when it didn't agree with them, they just moved me out of the way and did it anyways. So my stance changed nothing. But no, I didn't pause. There wasn't a second, not a millisecond between when she asked me to do it, I said no. I still worked there for a few weeks afterwards, and I was looking for jobs elsewhere. And I felt sick all the time over it, that I wasn't saying something to anyone. I wasn't letting people know that this thing that I built, that I had invested so much to make a trusted resource, was lying to them and telling them it was safe to go out when it wasn't. It literally made me sick. My boss flat out said to me, he said, "You look like shit," which is normally not an okay thing to say. But it had reached the point that exhaustion is one thing. I was exhausted the entire time. But coffee and Adderall does a lot for that. Prescribed by a physician in a legal way. But this was, people were going to die. And they did. Thousands of people who didn't have to die did. And I knew that was what was happening, and it made me sick. And I think that time period between when I refused to do it and when I decided to speak out, I did think about those ethics, thinking that, do I have an obligation to be a public person, to subject myself to all the things that come with that, which I think if you go to some of the things people have said about me on Twitter, you'll see is violent, very sexualized, abusive harassment. Is it my place to speak on this? Should I see if one of the epidemiologists wants to speak on this? All the things that I thought about doing, I was still making that choice about whether or not to do that when I was thrust into the spotlight anyways. I mean, I didn't have anything to do with it. People found out that I was taken off the project the week before, and there was an article about it by a reporter that I didn't speak to yet at that point. And the choice was completely taken away from me. But it was certainly something I was thinking about the entire time.
I can tell you that the interesting thing is that you talk a lot about insubordination, right? Like the idea of not doing what you're told. And in some instances, if you're in the military, you can be insubordinate to not follow a rule. We're not in the military right now. You also gave a great, kind of when we were talking, you said something I found very interesting, that history is written by the insubordinate. And I think that you also made a comment afterwards when I asked you if I could use that. You said, yeah, and that you found it interesting that people were hanging on to your words a bit and listening to what you're saying. And I think from my perspective, it's as a GIS professional and as a person who lives in this world, because work and life, there's both a balance and a split. But I guess I can say when you're in public health, it's both, your life and the life of your family. So it's pretty serious that way. But Can you talk a little about your, the insubordinate thing you've been, and sort of how that plays into, just how you're feeling and what you think about that?
Yeah, so when I was fired, I actually got the call before any of the press stuff had happened. And I was told that the state wanted to initiate separation of service. And I had the option to resign later that week. They gave me a few days to think about it. And I specifically asked, I said, was there a reason? And I said, because, they could have put whatever reason they wanted. If there was an actual reason, if I had not done my job well, which nobody ever accused me of, they just accused me of refusing to do it the way they wanted to, or if I had made a mistake, like was later claimed and uploaded something that didn't belong there, they would have put that. They would have covered their bases. But I was told it was the decision of the deputy secretary to separate from service. And I was like, well, okay, but why? And she just repeated the same line. It is the decision of so I have my termination letter and I've published it. There is no reason on there. There's not a reason listed. When DeSantis was asked about my ousting, he said at first, I don't really know anything about it. It's not an issue. I brought an email that said she was tired and she was going on vacation. So he didn't know anything about it, according to him at that point in time, which may very well be true. Who knows? We'll find out in the lawsuit, I'm sure. But the following few days, he changed his tune a lot, and said that I was fired for being insubordinate. Said specifically that there were a lot of people on the chain of command higher up than me, which is true, and I did not listen to them. And that's why I was fired. He said those words, and that's why she was fired, which isn't in disagreement with what I said happened. That's kind of the odd thing is that I said I was fired for refusing to do what one of my very high superiors told me to do because it was wrong. And he is also saying people very high up in the chain of command told me to do things and I refused to do them. And that's why I was fired. And so this whole insubordinate kind of term, he put that on me. It's not in my termination letter. I didn't start it. He did. And I found it almost funny and at the same time rude to call somebody insubordinate for not doing something wrong. In the military, they have their codes and their commands. And if somebody doesn't do exactly as somebody said, somebody could die and blah, blah, blah. But we're not in the military. I'm a public health official. I'm a manager of an entire office for the state. And I have laws that I have to follow as well, because falsifying health records is against the law. And what I was asked to do was illegal. And I said no. And that is insubordinate. And it's this term that is just thrown on people, especially women, when they just don't do what they're told. Just shut up and do what you're told. And that's very much what it felt like. Like, you just shut up. We're the people in charge. We're telling you to do it this way. Change the numbers, and we're going to go out and tell everybody that the person that's been doing the numbers fairly this whole time says that here they are and they're right. And I said no. And the fact that I had the audacity to say no just offended them. And I was insubordinate. And yeah, I own that. I still own that. That's the title of my book about what happened. It is literally the title. And I own that because there were so many other people during this period, especially when things started to reopen and people were speaking out. Doctors who got fired for just talking to the press about what was going on inside the ER. Managers of health departments. I think there was one in Orange County who got death threats for trying to pass a mask mandate. And she refused to bow down and pass the freaking thing until eventually it became so serious. I think she had to resign. And I was not the only one. There were people all over the country who were doing this, who were risking their jobs and in some cases their lives to tell people what was really going on when they were being told by somebody who supposedly knew better not to. And that is something I will have etched on my gravestone, is that I was insubordinate to the end. Because if people refuse to stand up to something that is so very wrong, like this was, then they control everything. These aren't people who were, experts in what we were doing. They didn't know as much of it as I did at that point. There's only one other person in the whole state of Florida who's worked with that data longer than me. They have no idea what it looks like, what it means when you add something a certain way. And to actually ask me to change the numbers so they look different, I honestly think anybody would have said no. But at the same time, there's a lot of people at the Florida Department of Health who knew what happened and haven't spoken out. So yeah, insubordinate people change the course. If I had said nothing, this is the crazy thing. I think if DeSantis hadn't said anything, I would have been fired and trying to secure another job, and I would have moved on with my life. That's probably what would have happened. But because he chose to publicly attack me, even though I hadn't done a single interview, I hadn't spoken to anybody, this happened. And now we're the only state in the country that has an equally successful competing data resource with the state, which is insane. And I run it by myself. So it's a little crazy. But that's how you change the course of things, is that you stand up and you just say, nope, I'm not doing that. And if they go after you, they do. That's awful. It's horrible sometimes. And it was by no means a good experience. But I felt obligated to continue to be insubordinate. Every day that I update my site, I'm being insubordinate. And I celebrate it, because he made it so that a lot of people can't trust the state's interface and their data, and a thing that I built. And I am trying to provide a resource for those people. Unfortunately, I understand there's a lot of people who probably don't believe either one. And I mean, I can't build a third thing to bend to a certain, ideology. I don't have the time for that right now, but yeah, I've been insubordinate my entire life.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, me.
Yeah.
Can I jump in for a second, Jay?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, that's why, with what Rebekah said, that's why I really love Jody being here, because Jody's perspective is a little different than mine. Please, Jody, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not in public health. I do not have the statistical background that you have, but I'm a GIS professional with my GISP. So I guess I'm looking for your perspective for the rest of the GIS community. What can we take away from your experience? And also, it's terrifying to hear what you're saying. Can I trust what I'm seeing on the news? So are there things that we can be asking when we're seeing the numbers being reported? Because it's not consistent across the country, and that's the other thing that's completely terrifying. What do we need to know about how to believe what we're seeing, I guess, in the news? So if you can talk to us non-public health GIS peers, that would be great.
Yeah, so understanding what's really going on is difficult, especially at the national scale, because there's no federal agency currently managing the system in a systemic way. And that's intentional. The model that was used for other states to try to base their stuff on was actually the one that I built. They specifically asked me to build a document of all the stuff that they were supposed to do that they sent to other state officials to copy. Someone like me shouldn't be the architect of how surveillance data for a pandemic is reported across the United States. That's not how this should go. But that's how it ended up. And a lot of states adopted it. So there was some standardization, and other states, just like Louisiana, my love, if I were to pick a place, despite all the places I've lived that is home, it is there. It does the funkiest things. So it is difficult. Some of the signals that I would say you could look for that are kind of hard to avoid are case counts and trends and hospitalizations and deaths. In Florida, the hospitalization and the death data are different agencies, but the governor specifically intervened twice to change how it's reported. So if you don't provide a legal Florida residence, then you're not counted. A lot of people don't give the ER their home address when they go. If it's a PO box, or if you don't provide one, or if it's not in the state, but you're there for COVID, you don't count. Not until you die, then you count. He also stepped in and intervened to say that only people with a primary diagnosis of COVID, who are there for primary reasons of COVID, could count. So people whose primary diagnosis was pneumonia, with COVID-19 as a complication factor. So people who develop pneumonia because of COVID-19 would not count. So they're even at various levels of agencies and government is intervention before that data gets to you. So when you see it, I always advise people to take it as a minimum. So this is the minimum of what is going on. This is the best possible picture, the most positive outlook of the situation that you could come up with. And across the country right now, it's not good. Cases are on the rise across the country. They're on the rise in Florida. Some of what's going on in Utah and Mississippi and Kentucky and South Dakota. A lot of these states are having waves that are already far exceeding any previous burst of cases that they've had. That's a bad sign. Cases precede hospitalizations, which precede deaths. And in a lot of states like Florida, deaths or follow a long lag of when they're reported. So all of this is lagged. It's a snapshot of a time that's come and gone a week to several weeks ago. But if that minimum picture is bad, if they're allowing you to see that it's that bad, then it's worse. That is generally my advice across all states. I know some states have a reputation better than others. But if they let you see that, that's a bad sign. After all the controls put in place, all the filtering, all the scrubbing, that's not good. And that would be my most non-scientific explanation for how to follow this and how to know what to trust is that it's a minimum of what we're experiencing. And I hate when people lump the media as this homogenous being that just like a blob that just absorbs and spits out junk as it pleases and all is on the same wavelength, because it's not. I've done interviews for every single agency almost except for any Fox affiliate in the country. And that's not because I denied them. I would totally do it if they asked me. They have never asked. They were never interested, not even when the story was all over the country. And every single person I've talked to is doing their best job to represent things fairly. They honest to God are. I went to journalism school. Some of my best friends are journalists across the country, and they're doing their best job. You have a couple bad ones, at your local news station or anything on Fox. That is not what to focus on. We as scientists and researchers need to make ourselves available to the media. I have always believed that. It's an anti-academic stance. I know that. They do not like that. But if you want them to be better informed so that they can better inform the public, then you have to make yourself available. If you don't, who the hell will? What expert are they going to trust if none of them will explain in a non-condescending, publicly accessible way what's going on? And I try to be as accessible as possible to everyone. I don't think I've denied an interview to anybody. Every single one that's asked me, I've been like, yes, we'll schedule a time, we'll do it. Because it's about the information. And if I don't provide the context to what I know and what I've experienced, who will? So that's very, very important when talking about the media, is making sure that we talk to them, because they try. They really try. Even that reporter who wrote that first story about me, the one that started all this, he has since then been just so on point. He apologized after everything happened. He had sent me an email the morning that the story came out that I didn't see because I was packing to go see my parents, and has since then forwarded every job offer that somebody approached him about for me, and been thorough and diligent, and he's a stellar reporter. So even sometimes when we think, my God, why would you do that? They're going on the best information that's available. And I, for my own reasons, was not available. And so the story about me did not include me. Again, I was packing, and I would like to think you try a little harder on one email, but this guy's good. He's really good. And he's written some great pieces. And he had a story that said, hey, the person who's been managing the system for the last several months was just abruptly taken off of it. And now it's not working. And there's data discrepancies. And all these experts in Florida, these like scientist doctors, are crying foul, I think was the term he used, and saying, look, nothing's been consistent since you left. It's like everything is broken. The data's changing. It's like we noticed a change in all these calculations. And that was bigger than me. That was something important, that those numbers were being fudged with or without my voice. And so he was doing his job. He had a story. He had legitimate experts telling him this has changed, and we know that she was taken off of it. And he had to report on that, with or without me, which is why you always need to be accessible and not be packing to go see your parents for the first time since their house was destroyed in an EF4 tornado on Easter. I know he still follows my career too. So I feel extra, love for him.
So
I'm not sure what the original question was, but we keep the winding road that is a conversation with Rebekah Jones.
No, it's a fascinating story. I'm so glad that you're sharing so much, and we don't want to interrupt you because what you're sharing is so valuable for us to hear. And I know that we have the highest participation in this keynote right now than any other session. So everyone wants to hear your story. And so we really thank you for sharing that. So my last question, from the GIS professional side of things, non-public health people, is when we had talked before, in preparation for this, you had started to share some lessons learned with us, and some of that had to do with documentation and just general CYA. So if you could just share again, your lessons, what can we take from your experiences, and how can we continue to carry the torch that you've ignited for GIS data ethics?
So the personal history as to why I started backing everything up that I got into is a whole other thing. But by the time this came around, I had been in the habit of saving text messages and emails for some time, especially if I thought that they were shady, or if just something felt off. And so when I was told that we didn't need the dashboard, I backed that up. And when I was told that it would cause a panic, I backed that up. And this should be a song, back it up. Want to cause a panic, back it up. Want to cause a crisis, back it up. Okay, that's going to end up on you as a meme somewhere.
We're recording this, so yeah, we're going to pull that clip out for sure.
That's going to end up on a remix, like on the troll sites or something. But so yeah, that was a habit I had to protect myself long before this happened. But as the situation escalated and more things were happening that were unsettling, I was approached by somebody from leadership and told that we weren't to email our conversations anymore because Florida has a public records law that includes all public employees, and they could be accessed that way. And people would misinterpret or misunderstand what we were talking about. They were so committed to this that they moved my office from my GIS office on the first floor to, I will admit, a huge corner office on the second floor, right next to my epi counterpart, so that we could talk and not have to email. That's how committed they were to making sure there were no records of what we were doing and why we were doing it. That to me was a signal to begin to write everything in an email. Somebody came in and asked me to do something, I'd immediately email them and said, hey, So following up on these specific things that you just asked me to do, can you clarify this and this and this? And even if they come back, because they sometimes did and said, hey, well, in the email you said this and this is what it means, I would be like, okay. And then as soon as they left, so you just clarified that this and this and this, I want to make sure it's right before I do it. Can you please give me final approval via email so I have a record? That's really important. When people tell you, oh, well, we don't really want to email or text about this, that means they're doing something wrong. That means they're doing something that they think was scrutinized or reviewed by somebody else would look bad. And in a public health crisis, it's really important to not make decisions that you think would be seen as dangerous or irresponsible or reckless. And so I documented everything. I backed up my email inbox every Friday. So I downloaded the whole thing in a CSV and put it off site. I forwarded emails to my private account. Sometimes I would blind CC my private account if it was really kind of important. And having that documentation is the only reason anybody believed me. When this whole story came out and I wasn't saying anything, for several days, I had been talking privately to Chris Cuomo, who's my buddy, and gave me this whole speech this morning. I was like, if I wear my glasses, are people going to like, you know, not listen to me? He was like, oh, worry about what you say, not how you look. And I said, yeah, that's real typical and easy for a man who doesn't even have a makeup artist to say. But I'd been talking to him for days on context. He is thorough. He would have never put me on his show if he had not vetted me, if he had not seen the emails that I forwarded him and all the documents that I backed up. I backed up data, you know, everything that I thought could potentially be important. And then a whole bunch of stuff that probably never was. I probably forwarded myself tons of emails that are completely irrelevant. But nobody would have ever believed me. I'm just some mid-level manager of the Department of Health who was fired for being insubordinate. And then with all the other accusations, they tried to basically make me look like some crazy person who they let run their system for months, who designed and ran their system for months, suddenly not qualified to do so and needed to be booted out during the reopening this same week as the reopening of the state. And yeah, that having that backup saved my life, probably because I have a team of lawyers who are working for me, not charging me, because they've seen what was done and what was said, and understand why it's important. And I don't honestly know how I would have navigated this without proof. And maybe that's why I felt a little more comfortable making the decisions that I did. I really started backing things up after I was first asked to change that. Every change that was made, I made sure I had it in an email, every detail, even if it was just, you know, we changed from updating twice a day to once a day the week we reopened. And that was because leadership wanted more time to review the data every day before we published it. And I made sure I had emails that said that political appointees were reviewing the data for hours. And that is why we had to do it once a day instead of twice. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff behind that too. And so, yeah, everything has to be copied. And even if you think nobody I work with would ever let this happen to me, yeah, they will. Because they'll look at what happened to me in those first few weeks and say, I am not putting myself through that. I'm not putting my family through that. Clearly, if you say something, they will go after you hard. The governor of my state publicly defamed me and slandered me for days. I thought for sure, you know, this is one day max, you know, the news cycle during the pandemic's got like a few hours of, you know, patients. Days. It was 4 straight days of it. And I was the #1 trending thing on Twitter. And I didn't even use Twitter back then. And which was the craziest part is I hated Twitter and I never used it. My sister ran my account. And I was the #1 thing on Twitter. She told me, she's like, hey, guess what? Guess who's trending? And I was like, great, thank you. And I was on Maddow. I was on Colbert. And even though he has not called me, he has said my name. And that is how widespread this was. And honest to God, if I didn't have the records, I think that this would have destroyed my career, which it's still TBD whether or not that has happened. I'm still unemployable, apparently. Nobody wants to hire the whistleblower, and nobody wants to hire the insubordinate, because even though they won't say it, they worry that if there's a conflict, if something is shady, that I'll just go straight to the press and run my mouth off, which I kept quiet about a lot of things for a long time at DOH, back when it was happening, because I was invested in my job and I realized the importance of it and the role that I played there. And so it's just very hard to convince people right now that I have all this expertise. I built this system that was hailed internationally as like the best. I built that from scratch by myself, and I can't get a job.
That's a great transition, actually, because, you know, with what you said about people and sending emails, I think the first thing I was told in state service is don't put something in an email that you wouldn't want to be unearthed during a subpoena, right? So you're right. If people can't be bothered to write that down, there's an issue. I have to, you know, and then the other thing, actually, was a great transition, what you just said, to let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now, right? The COVID monitor and COVID action and sort of how those things came about. I had mentioned it seemed like a big, stick it to the man for putting up your site, but you gave a really great other example of what it was for you. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So after I did my 5 minutes on Chris Cuomo's show, which was the only interview I wanted to do, I decided that I never wanted to be a public person. I didn't want my life turned upside down like that. I didn't want everything that came with that. I did 5 minutes to say, here's what's happening in Florida and here's why it matters. Nothing about me, just this is what has happened and this is why this is important. And then I went away because I did not choose to be thrown out that way. I would have never chose. I mean, if I was ever going to go to the press, which I had thought about, let's be honest, I wouldn't have done it in a public manner. I would have been an anonymous source for something. And this was a choice that was taken, that was stolen from me. And so when I did that interview, I decided I was going to have nothing to do with this. I was done. I wasn't even going to file the complaint because I wanted it to go away. I had a 6-figure job offer the Friday before I was fired. And a few hours after DeSantis basically made up stories about my college sex life in an abusive relationship I was in, the final interview, the meet and greet, which was really just the final, here's the team that you're going to be managing. I waited for them for the Zoom call, and they just didn't show up. And then I got a message saying they were going in a different direction. So I spent the next few weeks trying to find a job. I got a lot of very tech offers, advanced computer algorithm, actual data science, not just scientists who use data, but actual data science, like computational algorithms. I don't do that. Lots of really legitimate job offers doing that, but unfortunately, I don't know how to do that. I consider, why don't I just take one and, I'll figure it out. But none that, I could do. I mean, the Broad Institute at MIT actually reached out to me about doing something like that, very aggressively. And I was like, I really want to join your team, but I don't look at what you guys are doing. Like the stuff you're doing, I can't do. I can't do like analysis of human genomes and stuff. I'm a geographer. I study people moving over places, plagues, disasters. Like that's what I do. I study disasters in every form. And I'm not qualified for this. If you put me in charge of this, I'm afraid I'd create some kind of mutant half-breed fish squirrel person. And so nothing materialized, although some got pretty far. And so I'm just sitting at home for weeks after having been through this, having, this one AP reporter looking through my windows to see if I was actually home and showing up at my house at all hours and hiding from people. Really depressed about what was happening and not sure how to navigate it. And what I was seeing during this time was all those models we were asked to make, the ones that they never used, the things that we predicted were happening at a much more accelerated rate because the governor pushed us into phase 2 prematurely. And I saw that this tool that I had created, spent so much time into putting into, a lot of people didn't trust it anymore because it was politicized when I was fired. Because I'm liberal. So therefore, I'm a liberal plant that's just there to destroy DeSantis. And I worked under his administration for 2 years, under multiple disaster response teams, and never had a problem with him. I freaking praised the guy a month before he got fired for how well Florida was handling, because we plateaued when everybody else was skyrocketing. And I actually told people, I didn't vote for him. I thought he was crazy in the primaries with this whole making his kids build the wall thing, but he did some good things, especially on the environmental side, that were pleasantly surprising. He seemed like a well-tempered person, and I didn't hate the guy. I said that to people. And when it came out, for some reason, I was pitted against him specifically. And that made it a partisan issue. So now half the state of Florida didn't have a resource for information. And whether or not I wanted to be a participant in that process, I had a role in that. And I felt that same kind of helplessness about not knowing where to go for real information, and had the tools and the knowledge and the expertise, and knew where all the resources were that the state published but never advertised they had. And so I felt obligated to build something that people could trust. I was still using their data, and I make that limitation very clear, which is why they can't criticize me for using fake data, because it's their data. And I put all of that on there, though. So I'm comparing what DOH is saying to what ACA is saying, the hospital administration. So DOH's hospitalization numbers are always a fraction of what ACA's are. And they have different standards for reporting. And DOH never added hospitalization data to our resources. They never add Department of Corrections data, even though it's there and it's published every day. They never added Department of Emergency Management stuff, even though I worked closely and was very good friends with some of the people in that office. I pulled all of that in and said, here's a full picture of what is going on across the state as best as we know it. Again, that kind of minimum bar. And I didn't think anybody would care after the, kind of visceral public reaction in May. And I remember my sister set me up a GoFundMe when that happened, when I was first fired. And by the 3 weeks later, when I launched the dashboard, I had about $5,000 in it, enough to get me through a month of rent and all my other bills. And I launched the new dashboard on the 11th. And when I woke up on the 12th, I had $50,000 in my GoFundMe. And this kind of thing that I was doing just to, make it available pretty much suddenly became, people actually need this. They feel like they need this. You don't raise $50,000 overnight because people want to stick it to DeSantis. You raise that because they want you to be able to do this for them because they don't have anywhere else. And I thought, wow, that was more than I would have taken home in an entire year managing GIS for the entire state of Florida Department of Health. At first, we can get a whole thing about how underpaid we are, but that was more take-home pay than I would have earned in that year doing this project. So I said, hey, I don't have any job offers. People need this, clearly. I'll do it. I will do it. I will do it until it's not needed. And did a lot of press after it kind of blew up. When things got really bad in July, the single largest increase for any state to date, I got more and more donations because people realized, holy shit, she was telling the truth the whole time. And later, when people had contacted me, people I was still in contact with at DOH, told me DeSantis is holding back cases in the lead up to July 4th so that, we can have the holiday weekend. And twice in August, they found 4,000 cases each time in that time period. People started realizing, oh my God, she actually knows what you're talking about. So I got $236,000 doing this project. And that will fund me and pay my bills and my rent as I work on the COVID monitor, which I am not paid for, is entirely volunteer. We fundraise for it, but it all goes to FinMango to manage our volunteer base, help pay for, our products and stuff like that. And our Google rep is volunteering. It's all, I'm one of the managers, I volunteer. Everybody there is a volunteer. I don't see a cent of that. And that's fine, because people supported me enough over this, long project to be able to do this, to choose what I do with my time, which is really a blessing in and of itself. Choose the projects that I want to do, start something up if I want to. And now I'm focusing most of my efforts on the COVID monitor, because the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, I think yesterday or the day before, publicly said that it's not their job to collect this data. It's up to the districts to do it. Some states have said the same thing. Florida did for a long time. If they want to report it, whatever. Florida even actually tried to stop districts from reporting it for a while. That data needs to be collected, because when we go to research this, there's going to be a lot of places that have to build that information from scratch. And now there is a timeline that updates almost every single day. As long as I'm not dead, it's going to be updated. I shouldn't say that because there's probably crazies out there, but it will be updated every day, and they won't have to rebuild that record. And you can go on there and search for your school district. And we have now up almost 4,000 districts out of the 13,000 in the country, 13,286 public school districts. And I think we have like 3,956. So we're getting close. And you have to keep in mind, California's closed. And, most of the West Coast is closed. A lot of states aren't opening up right now, and they're doing it gradually. So we're building this interface. And my honest to God hope, after spending all this time with it, is that we'll have an administration soon that will take it off my hands and say, this should be a federal effort to do this. And I won't have to do it. And then whenever that happens, I will want a normal job again. I go to work at 9, I'm home at 5 or come home at 5, and I can leave it off my shoulders again. I mean, I work in climate change, so, I'm used to death and destruction being surrounded me all the time. So it's never really off my shoulders, but, that's what I hope. I honest to God, all I've ever wanted is to help people, to make suffering less in the world. Which is why I had such a problem with what was going on at DOH, and why I still do this, even though I'm tired all the time. But yeah, that's what I'm doing, and that's where I'm going. And I'm just really hoping that I don't have to keep doing this, and that there will be somebody taking over this at a much more manageable level, because right now we're just a team of volunteers who are the only people who's collecting this nationwide. And that's kind of insane. Although Google helps a lot. So you can actually do the search by district, and it will pull up case data for your county and your state. And it also has Google search tags. So like people who are searching fever or cough, because we have Google, we can get that stuff like immediately. And we don't have to pay them for it, which is the best part. So, FanMango manages the volunteers, and I get to, I do a lot of the grunt work, to be honest, because the volunteers are college kids and other young professionals, and, they have stuff to do. And so they can't do it every day. So I go in and I do it. And then I also do this, and, I'm on CNN, and yesterday I was on British television. So, it's a little crazy, and there should be an entire office at the federal level dedicated to do this, with people who are paid what their time is worth. Because if I've learned anything, the public will pay you $236,000 to do something that I would not have been paid $50,000 to do. So they clearly value what we do, and we need to demand that we get paid fairly for it. So that's where I'm going.
Wow. Well, I mean, those words are powerful. And again, I think I'm going to paraphrase what you said. We used it on some of our posters on your special guest page, but you talk about how things, it can't be. It's not all about what had happened. It's really about where you're going with things. And I love the idea someday of you being able to have this weight lifted off your shoulders, because you're right. Standardization of this work, bringing it up a level, is what needs to happen for public health and public safety. That's incredible. Well, here's what I'm thinking. I've seen a lot of questions come in, and we talked about in the beginning having a discussion, right? So
Yep.
I want to ask you one question, and then we'll go to question and answers, and we'll come back. My question is, we've been talking on this conference, and Jack Dangerman started it off, and we played a clip from him with our aha moments. Actually, Jody asked Jack this question of when the moment was for you when the light bulb went off, and you really either realized what GIS was or what you could do with GIS. Would you just briefly touch on that, and then we'll do some question and answers?
Sure. So I was at Syracuse. There were two for me. There was one that sparked my interest in earth science, and then there was one that sparked my interest in GIS, and they went in that order. So I grew up in South Mississippi, way South Mississippi, way more Cajun than Dixie, end of the world kind of stuff. Like we would identify more with Louisiana than Mississippi. And we learned French, like that's our second language. We have an actual French second language. And I remember I was in my sophomore year of earth science, and my geology professor, because that was one of my majors, was explaining that the earth spun, wobbled, tilted, orbited, moved within its plane of orbit. And I remember thinking all of that at once, because I didn't know that, because where I grew up in high school, we didn't have earth science. We didn't have science. There was the mandatory 9th grade biology class, and that was it. Mississippi education for you. And I remember thinking that, oh my God, those cycles are just like trying to visualize in my mind. And that for me was like, God, this earth is amazing. Look at all these things it's doing at once. So I started to get really into earth science. And I was in a class with Jane Reed at Syracuse University, who was still like my idol. And it was a global environmental change class. So it was a climate change class. And we were looking at satellite imagery of change in places. And I had gone through a lot of hurricanes as a kid, Katrina, George, and I experienced, islands disappearing from those hurricanes. And so I was very curious about that. And I remember I downloaded some Landsat imagery, which, back then was as good as it got, and for free anyways. And I remember looking at Ship Island before Hurricane George, and then looking at it right after. And what I witnessed the first time I stepped off the boat going there, I went, oh my God. I was like, I can measure exactly how many like grains of sand this island lost from this one storm. And I became fascinated with it, just watching the earth change from satellite imagery. It was amazing to me. It was so amazing. And I had to see something from the sky that you had experienced on the ground, because that was the first time I'd ever been to an ocean. I was actually born in central Pennsylvania. So when we went to Ship Island when I was a kid, that was it. And I remember the first time we went out there was 2 months before George hit, 1998. And we went afterwards because everybody was going out to see it. And I remember as a kid thinking, the sky can do that to the surface. Like, that's incredible. And ever since then, I've been, fixated on disasters and hurricanes. And for me, the way to study that was from observation from satellite data. So this whole me doing social modeling and things, that came much later. My undergraduate and my master's both focused on basically paleotempestology, historical hurricanes, through satellite imagery and through, proxy data. And I analyzed 400 and something Landsat images of, the islands to understand their rhythms and how hurricanes impacted them, how a hot summer impacted the impact of hurricanes, all kinds of things. And I remember thinking, you can do all of this with pictures. Isn't that amazing? Just from pictures. And that for me I loved it. I absolutely loved it. My hard drive crashed halfway through my master's degree and I had a near nervous breakdown, this is pre-cloud being like the default. Cloud back then, I'm so old. Cloud back then was extremely expensive. It didn't have much space and nobody was really using it. So when my external hard drive crashed, I cried a lot, a lot, but at least I was like, well, at least I know what I'm doing now. So like, I don't have to recreate it. But yeah, that was it for me, is seeing those islands that I saw as a kid just disappear and come back, disappear and come back. That blew my mind.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, that's what I can say is a lot of the board has felt. I mean, this discussion has been incredible. I saw some people just like mentioning that. We've all been looking forward to this discussion. The aha moment discussion was really cool on Monday because you got to hear people from different aspects of GIS and life talk about how they ran into it. And if you want a good kick, listen to Jack Dangerman talk about his aha moment was creating GIS. So, if that was yours, you win. You got the bingo space. Let's go. You're on it.
Yeah, I can't do that. I am very sorry to everybody for dashboards. That is really my fault. I will actually say it's Johns Hopkins and my fault. Because now everybody uses them and they'll call tables dashboards now. They'll be like, oh, we have a table on our website. It's a dashboard. And I might be somewhat responsible for that, the prevalence of those things. And so I'm sorry. Very sorry.
Save your sorries when they're needed. That sounds good. All right. So Pam, do you want to get into a few questions from the audience?
Hi, sure. We have a bunch of questions. I'm first going to start off by just two comments that we received. One is from Mike, who said, hearing Rebekah's story firsthand is the best possible keynote for this conference. Thank you so much for making this possible. Rebekah is now my all-time data integrity hero. So thank you again for joining us today. And Fran also said that this is better than the best TV I have recently watched. Your story is fascinating, scary, moving, inspiring, and she's on the edge of her seat. So
I'm on the edge of my seat. I sit on a ball chair, so I'm always on the edge. So I'm joining you there.
And Jody got the blue screen of death on her computer, which is why she's been popping in and out. So we're winging it.
That is the story of my life, is winging it.
Yep. Okay, so on to some questions. So if you had to speculate, what would you think, or what do you think would be the motivations for the state for manipulating the numbers like they asked you to do?
I don't speculate about things. I try very carefully, considering my legal, lawsuit currently against the state. If I didn't personally see it or experience or have documentation of it, I don't do it. I know that what I was asked to do at that point in time was to change basically the standards that we had for allowing places to reopen, so that places that did not meet those standards could reopen despite that, and to make it look like the data matched. That's what I was asked to do. Other than that, I don't do speculation. That gets you in trouble. Yep. We're scientists. We shouldn't do too much of that.
So, were there any repercussions for the contractor that stepped in and made the data match the state's plan?
I have no idea. I don't even know who the contractor was. Somebody told me at one point and I forgot about it. Some consulting firm, but I doubt it. There haven't been repercussions for anyone in that process. The same people who asked me to do that are still running the response, despite how horrible everything went. They're still there. Probably, and this is what I will speculate about, because any termination of any of those people for a poor job just gives me more ammunition to prove that they should have never been there in the first place and were doing things that were not right.
Right.
So no repercussions yet. A lot of people have left since then. So the director of infectious disease actually quit after 15 years on the day that DeSantis, the governor, announced that he'd be reopening schools, brick and mortar, and schools would be required to open 5 days a week in person. He quit that day. He had been running the response from the epidemiology side the entire time. He quit, walked away, got a camper, went to California. became unreachable. I'm not kidding you. That's what he did. I spoke to him briefly after that happened. I told him, good for you. And we never really got along, which is the ultimate irony. Is I can recognize when people did something right or they did something good, even if they don't like me. And he did something good and right. And even though he never spoke out, his resignation on that day was a statement. And other people have left since then. But no, to my knowledge, no one has been fired for doing things that, or asking me to do things that are illegal, or any of the other behavior. No one. Not even for mishandling the response. They haven't even replaced the people who don't know what they're doing that caused what happened in July in the first place. So no. If you're connected, there are never repercussions. It's middle management GIS people that get fired.
It's not good.
Nope.
Let's see. Jennifer asked, most businesses do not ask for a GISP certification. Medical doctors have the Hippocratic Oath that they take, which is their code of ethics. Do you think that the GISP's code of ethics and a lawsuit can possibly solve the issues, solve issues like this going forward?
I don't know. I think we need to really emphasize the value of a GISP and make it a standard practice, no different than being licensed, for any other type of profession. I use the GISP as a justification as to why I should get paid more, because we do get paid more. And I think that can be both an advantage if you're already there and a disadvantage if you're trying to get a job. Because if they're looking at two people and one has this professional license that they don't understand or know anything about, one's cheaper, they're going to go with the cheaper one. If you're demanding more money for that, but at least in my female experience. So I think that we really need to emphasize that there is a standard similar to a licensure in this field, and you should be looking to get those people because they have proven that they know what they are doing. Because I mean, if any of you, have taken the exams, they're tough. The director of GIS for the Department of Emergency Management failed the exam first time. That's not a diss to him. It's hard. It is hard to be able to prove that you know how to do this competently in a variety of areas, and then have these other things that you agree to be a member of this community, to say, I will not do X, Y, and Z. And we just really need to make that the standard for somebody who's a professional in this practice.
Let's see. We have so many questions here. So when this is all over, do you think you will look back and reassess your role in getting the information out the way you did? And is it something you would do again?
I'm going to assume that's in context of what happened at the end.
Yeah.
And yes, but I probably would have recorded people on my phone too, especially when dealing with leadership, because conversations are very hard to document, even if you follow them up with emails. But yeah, I would have done it. And I think I would have spoken up earlier. I was terrified of the idea of speaking out. Terrified. I begged that reporter I mentioned to take the story down. I literally emailed him and said, please take this down. I was like, I'm trying to get a job. I just got fired, please. And he was all right. He was like, well, I mean, if you're getting calls about it, it's too late. But like I said, he tried to make up for it. But I was terrified. I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think the first time I did my interview with Chris Cuomo, and I'm doing it now, actually, if you see me looking down, I'm like, I learned to grip my hands like this over and over again as a nervous kind of thing. I sit on a ball chair because I can adjust myself without it being as noticeable. And I'm still terrified of it. I'm still just kind of going through this as I can, trying not to embarrass myself or make an ass out of myself. And I didn't think I could do it. I think looking if I could do it again, I'd go public immediately. And I would explain everything that was going on as it was happening. I would have been fired a lot earlier, I'll tell you that. But yeah, I would do it again. And the only thing different is I would have accepted that was my role, that this was my part in this journey that we're all through, and done it sooner. That's the only thing I would have done.
We're a little bit past our ending time. I don't know if you want
If we don't get cut off, I'm totally
more
fine.
questions or
Yeah,
Well, I
I mean,
saw some kind of good questions I kind of would like to answer, if that's
yeah,
okay.
go for it.
yeah.
Okay.
Just to be clear, we booked this for an extra 15 minutes, and we can go however long we want. So just keep going. Thank you.
Okay. So I saw two questions that are kind of related. I want to kind of lump them together. So Thad asked about Dr. Fauci and how he's come under fire for some of his actions and statements. And also mentioned, asked, do you feel like the government in general is kind of attacking science in an attempt to push their agenda? Both of those things are related, right? Because Fauci's being attacked because he's a scientist and he's saying this winter is going to be bad. He publicly said Florida should not have reopened when it did. It doesn't matter. Dr. Fauci's on my side. But after the fact, he said it shouldn't have opened. It should not have opened. How much redemption does a person need? You got Fauci saying, no, that was a bad call. And I was like, I told everybody it was a bad call. I got fired for that. But yes, it's definitely under attack. And I also try to emphasize this is not new. This attacking science that is inconvenient to pull on to, Al Gore is not new. Look at climate change. No other country has the kind of climate change denialism that we do. There's not a debate as to whether or not the science is legitimate in the developed world, except for here. I always bring up, the doctors who first published information that cigarettes cause cancer. Because up to that point, there were doctors who were paid to do studies to find that cigarettes were good for you. And when they first started, that is legitimate, you can look that up. When they first started to report that, no, these are killing people, the doctors were fired from their positions at universities or hospitals. They were publicly defamed. They were threatened. They were attacked. They were driven mad by some of the things that were happening to them by the Heartland Institute and some others. And that alone, if you only look at doctors trying to warn people that cigarettes cause cancer, which now everybody knows, even people who smoke know. They don't care, but they know that was a controversial medical advancement in our understanding that this is not new. I mean, Galileo went to house arrest because he supported Copernicus. I mean, that is literally throughout history, this has happened. I don't see myself as in nature to Dr. Fauci. He's a hero. But yeah, there were some early missteps, but okay, no, pandemic, we had to do what we had to do. It's now public knowledge that we told people that they didn't need to buy masks because in Florida, I know this for a fact, we didn't have enough for medical personnel. And if everybody started buying them, we would not have the ones that we need. So we intentionally lied to people for a period of time, knowing what would happen because we needed medical personnel to have them. But I also would say, if they hadn't had them, getting them to the medical personnel was the priority because they were the people most exposed and they would be the largest reduction in risk if you gave them to them. But we lied about that. And that's bad. And then, Dr. Fauci did that too, so it's bad. But other than that, he's been unwavering in the science that is current, accepted, and most broad. And yeah, he's been under attack. He has, I think, what are they called? Secret Service people guarding him now. This is a little upsetting, but a few days ago, I had to report a tenured professor at Florida Atlantic University for harassment. I wrote a letter to the university showing them all these things he had said about me, sexual things, aggressive things, disgusting things that he had either posted himself or retweeted from other people. And he's been doing this for months. He's been doing this since May, obsessively. Every time I do an interview, he does it. And I wrote them and said, how can you defend this person? Because the dean of the college wrote a letter of support for him publicly. And I was like, you're talking about how hard his criticism of his business, view of coronavirus was, which is very off. It's like, how do you see this advancing scientific discourse? And when I reported it, nothing happened. no, they didn't respond. So I tweeted that I reported it. And somehow him and his graduate student who poses as a professor online managed to comment on my own thread, even though they're blocked. And we're telling people to tell me to unblock them. And one of them even posted, and this is a quote, "First blood. I didn't start this, but I am a good finisher. I sure hope she doesn't hurt herself," or something. Sorry, which I couldn't interpret as any other thing than a threat. First blood is a reference to Rambo. If you don't know, so is the quote afterwards. And Rambo is a person who slaughtered an entire police force because they unfairly targeted him because he was a Vietnam veteran. He killed them all. And that was what this person was saying. So with that, I understand what Fauci is going through, but I don't have Secret Service. When he posted that a few days ago, I actually considered just going to New York and visiting my husband's family for a little while because I felt unsafe. I can't take any action really against him because it's not explicitly a direct threat, even if that's clearly what it is. But the university president, his response to this was he blocked me on Twitter. That's what happened. And so there's not much I can do. And I get it. It's horrible. It's awful. Nobody should have to be subjected to that ever for any reason, especially just because they're doing the science and they're doing their job. It's insane. And I've never formally encountered this person either. And so this is a tenured professor at a business school in Florida. And they're standing behind him. It's madness. It is absolute madness. And we have this feeling when we talk about people like that, like they're just crazy, people in the middle of Nebraska on their computer, blah, blah, blah. This is a university endorsing, not just not condemning, endorsing this man and his behavior. And so it's not just, some redneck or hick out in the middle of nowhere making idle threats. A person with connections who is being shielded by his university. So, yeah, I get that. But we can answer another one because that's kind of a bummer thing to end on. Somebody wants to pick an optimistic one. What is sunshine and rainbows? Sunshine and rainbows.
First of all, working for a university, I cannot believe that they are standing behind him. That is just so
I can.
wrong.
I've seen
I'm
some
sorry
pretty
that's
awful
happening.
things.
That is awful. Let us know if we can help in any way. Seriously.
I think I've hit the limit of my capability unless he shows up to my house with a gun. And by then, if it ever reaches that point, it's too late. So, I mean, he's not like in Florida to get an injunction. It pretty much has to be a domestic violence situation. And I've never met this person. And I may have spoken to him accidentally on Twitter at some point months ago, but never had any interaction with him. And he does this. And he's been doing this for months. And there's nothing I can do about it legally. And if I try to get an injunction and for some reason a judge who may not be influenced by the major role that universities play in our judicial system and politics, then it looks really bad. It looks like I tried to file a false complaint against somebody, even though I saved his tweets. He got kicked off Twitter. You know how bad something has to be to get kicked off Twitter? He was kicked off Twitter for a whole day and they removed a bunch of their tweets. And it's just, universities are different than any other entity or infrastructure invested in protecting itself. I've learned that too. Yeah. But let's see positive. Okay.
So one last question because we are running out of time. Is the COVID monitor accepting more GIS volunteers at any level?
Yes, we are. My God, yes.
So how does someone volunteer?
So you can email me at plans@thecovidmonitor.com. Plans is in planning. I know sometimes I say my A's with a Southern accent and it's hard for people to understand. PLANS@thecovidmonitor.com. But yeah, you can, there's a volunteer form at thecovidmonitor.com. But if you just want to hit it directly, especially if you're a professional or whatever, that is excellent. And it's plans@thecovidmonitor.com.
Awesome. I just put that in the chat. So
we really want to build this out until, January, when a new office is created to do this for me. No, take it, man. Government can do way more than I can do by myself at home. So yeah. And please check it out. And if you know of school districts that are reporting and we don't have it on our map, which I'm sure there are hundreds in that situation, let us know. We'll add it. Because that is using the official data is incredibly important for epidemiological studies and modeling and every effort that's going on across the country to understand this virus right now. And we want as much of it as we can. If it's not in there, it's not because we're lazy. It's because we're slowly getting to all of the states in the country that are opening faster than we can collect them. So yeah, let us know. You see problems, let us know. I'm totally up for fair criticism all the time, forever.
Here's what I think. First of all, hearing what you said about what someone said to you, I don't care gender, male, female, hearing that is incredibly disturbing. And I'm sorry you have to go through that. I think honestly, I'm going to paraphrase you again, but on your COVID monitor site, you put, and I'm going to paraphrase what you said, but basically like you didn't know if when you did this, people would actually follow you. And I just want to tell you from the position that I'm sitting in with the board behind me and this whole audience here, like we're following this. This is really landing with all of us. And I just, to me, what you're saying and what you're doing, it means a ton. And everyone, I keep seeing it, right? Go out and vote. Make this change happen, please.
I live in Florida, so my vote actually counts. When I lived in New York, it didn't count. When I lived in Louisiana, Mississippi didn't count. But now it counts. Hopefully it'll be counted. I mailed it in, so we'll see.
Well, what I want to say is this, Rebekah. I know that we had invited you to Mappy Hour. I know also that, you had to rework CNN for us. So I was going to wait till Mappy Hour to tell you, but everyone, just so you know, during our Mappy Hour event, we're going to have a virtual tip jar. It's going to be a link to Florida COVID Action's donate page. And we're hoping that we can raise some money to really help this cause. And to start that, NEURISA is going to start with $250 as a thank you, and really just say that this means so much to us. And, this relationship that we started with you, it's only the beginning. So honestly, from the bottom of our hearts, thanks for being here today and really being the glue that brought this whole thing together. And, is there anything else you want to close with?
No.
I want to
Thank you.
We made her cry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's been a really hard few days dealing with this situation and threats of violence, and just every time I hear that people understand that this is important, this matters, and they think I'm doing it for the right reasons, and being believed right now is so. Thank you, and
awesome.
Everyone.
Awesome. Well, like I said, this is the start. Again, everyone, please check out Rebekah's page. And, keep fighting the good fight, please, because NEURISA started with their letter. NEURISA is following right up and saying, we got your back, and anything we can do to help, we're here, okay? Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, guys.
All
Have
right,
a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have never cried on camera before. All of the interviews I've done, I've never been brought to tears. So I was always afraid people would share it, and because I've been emotional about a lot of the stuff, but I've held it back and be like, oh, look at the crying, emotional, crazy person, because I have to fight that image as a woman. And it's been a rough few days. Yeah. And I being here has been great. Talking to you guys is always great, and having support means the world.
Awesome. Well, listen, we'll talk to you soon. We'll be in touch. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and tell CNN we said what's up, please.
I will.
All right,
Bye,
folks.
guys.
We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Yeah.